What is up guys, Blue Spooky here with another daily video. If you guys are enjoying these longer Megamixes and the regular daily videos, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. Doing any of these helps to make sure the videos do well and that the channel does well, so I can continue making these videos for a long time to come. If you guys are curious about any censored words in the video, it's because I've been getting flagged for quote-unquote inappropriate language on pretty much all my new videos I put out, which is really affecting the channel. I'm doing my best to try and make sure that that's not happening, but if you guys would like to support the channel further than you already do, go ahead and click that join button somewhere around the subscribe button. It's only $2 a month at the lowest tier, and you get a special logo next to your name whenever you comment, as well as access to special emoticons. No content will ever be locked behind the paywall there. It's purely an optional thing you can choose to do if you'd like to support the channel any further than you already do. Without further ado though guys, thank you so much for watching, and I will let you guys get right into the true scary stories. I'll see you again at the end of the video. I thought I'd share an occurrence that happened to my husband and I while driving back home in November. It was early morning, maybe 4 or 5 a.m. or so. I was accompanying him to work because I needed the car that day. We share one car and used to work together. My husband starts work at around 5 or 5:30. Anyway, it was very dark out. While I live in a somewhat residential area, it's still a pretty rural town, with long stretches of road bordered solely by dense woods. A few minutes into the drive, we reached one such area. Note, there are no sidewalks on these roads, so it's pretty uncommon to see someone walking along them. That morning, though, I noticed a figure. It was odd, but I warned my partner to slow down a little, worried this person might be lost or distraught in some way. It was a genuinely strange area to be in at such an hour. He slowed down, though clearly without the intention to stop all the way. I swear, what we saw next was something straight out of a horror movie. The person was moving very slowly. As we approached them, our headlights made it progressively clearer what we were seeing. There was this old Chinese lady, wearing all red clothes and walking with her chin down and tucked into her red scarf. The moment our headlights shone upon her directly, she stopped immediately, jerked her head up, and began screaming and grimacing with her eyes and mouth wide open. She then made a motion as though she was going to attempt to jump at the car. Thankfully, she was not close enough to succeed. But what the heck was that? My husband just shrugged it off and believes it was all a prank of some sort, but I still think about that every now and then whenever we're driving back home. By the way, on the way back, I didn't see her again. Any thoughts on the situation? I'm a model and was doing some work for a catalog out of state. During our break, I stated that I was going to walk back to the hotel to grab my charger, as it was only about a block away. One of the video crew offered to walk with me, as he had something he wanted to grab from the hotel as well. We got to the hotel with no problems, but I left the location by myself. Almost as soon as I walked out the door, a man approached me and said, "I saw you walking around earlier." I had been in the hotel for about 20 minutes, which means he must have followed us there and had been waiting for me this whole time. He continued to walk alongside me, trying to ask me all sorts of personal questions. I tried to politely get out of the conversation by telling him that I had to go back to work and that I couldn't talk to him right now. Of course, that didn't dissuade him at all. He continued to follow me and bombard me with questions the entire way back to where I was shooting. When I got there, He asked me to come swimming in the river with him. I told him I couldn't because I had to work. I was afraid to be too stern or tell him off directly because I've heard too many stories of men like that suddenly becoming violent in such a situation. I started feeling nervous as I tried to open the door to the building. He followed me there and was now standing right behind me. Much to my surprise, the door was locked. I started running around to every door, desperately trying to get inside as he followed right behind me. They were all locked. Now I was really in a panic. All of a sudden, a car with 2 women inside pulled over and yelled at me to come over. Immediately, the man turned around and booked it down the street, then disappeared. The girls told me they saw what happened and asked me if I needed a ride somewhere. I explained I just needed to call someone to get inside, and it seemed like the man was gone now. I got on the phone with the other model. She was on her way to open the door. I told the girls I was okay now. The man was gone, and so they went on their way. Almost as soon as the girls drove away, though, the man appeared from around the corner of the street he'd gone down. It seemed he'd just been watching, waiting for them to leave so I could be alone again. He was walking very fast toward me. I ran up the stairs and started banging on the door, desperate to get in. Just as he was right on my heels about to reach me, the door opened. I jumped in and closed it fast behind me. Needless to say, I was very shaken. I never feel safe when I walk anywhere now, no matter how short the distance. Even walking across the parking lot is a stressful experience for me now. This is a fairly short and simple encounter, but it really bothers me whenever I think about it. I was 18, female by the way, and was walking home alone from a night out with some friends. For some reason, I remember feeling like I was invincible. It's something I would never do now, even if I hadn't been drinking. I was walking back on a main road by the sea, but because it was very early in the morning, there was absolutely nobody around. It was almost pitch black out. All of a sudden, a man in a yellow car slowed down beside me and yelled out to me, "Get in, I'm a taxi! Come on!" Thing is, taxis are required to be black where I live and have to have certain stickers to identify them as a legit taxi. I was drunk, but I was not stupid enough to buy this. This man was not a taxi driver. I kicked up a real fuss and began to shout at him. He followed me for a while, but as another person rounded the corner, he drove off quickly. What bothers me is that if he tried to physically overpower me and force me into his vehicle, he probably could have. This happened when I was in the 4th year of elementary school. I joined a local school volunteer group when I was that age. Just to give you some background on what it entailed, it was a program led by university students. Basically, we would volunteer to clean up litter, do some gardening stuff, and things like that to help out the community. It wasn't all work though. We got some really great camping trips because of our efforts. I really enjoyed it. This experience takes place during that year's summer vacation. We were set to be camping out by an abandoned forestry school deep out in the mountains. I don't remember all that well, since I was really young at the time. A few details may be either missing or a little sparse because of that. There was a river that flowed near that abandoned school, and we elementary school students were having a ton of fun playing and swimming within it. The river flowed upstream, and there were lots of large rocks and stones on the riverbed. There were some jutting out of the water as well. Although the current was pretty strong, we were still able to swim there just fine. We didn't really care about distance swimming. We were just really paddling around having fun in the water. It was pretty deep in some areas, so some of us were looking for a place to dive in. I also realized at that point that it would be possible to swim under the little bridge they had over the river. I don't know if we were supposed to be allowed to do all that we did, but the university students didn't really seem to want to stop us. Honestly, they seemed a fair bit distracted. I doubt this kind of thing would be allowed nowadays. My neighbor had also joined this camping trip. I'll just call her A now. A wasn't the quickest learner. That's about as gently as I can put it. She was a bit slow and got bullied by other students sometimes. While I was diving in the river, I saw that A was struggling to keep her head above water level. I dove in. I was underwater, thinking that she really looked like she was struggling. She probably hadn't swam much before at all. When I came up, she looked like she was struggling even more. It looked like she was on the verge of drowning. I yelled to my campmates on the shore for help, but none of them were able to react quickly enough. As I was about to yell louder, all of a sudden I felt something grasp against my leg. A, who was currently floundering, had grabbed a hold of my leg and was pulling me down with her. She was a lot stronger than I thought she would be. I guess fear for one's life can bring out hidden strength unknown to the individual. I was desperately trying to get to the surface. A's hand tightened its grip around my ankle. I even felt her long hair getting tangled around my legs and between my toes. It was awful. I felt so breathless. I felt as though I was going to die. I was in complete panic mode, and I had no time to think of her. It didn't even enter my mind. All I could think of was my own survival. Although I knew it would be painful, I decided to open my eyes and look down and see what I could do to escape. I wasn't ready for what I saw, though. I didn't see an elementary school student grabbing a hold of my ankle. Instead, I saw a pale adult woman grabbing onto me. Her dark hair swayed in the water like seaweed. I remember thinking that very clearly, because I remember thinking straight after that I wasn't in the sea. I was in a river. It was such a mad thought. I could see her other pale hand reaching out and attempting to grab my other ankle. If this woman got a hold of my other ankle, I knew I would be done for. A lot happened in the space of a couple of seconds, but the thought that jumped to the forefront of my mind was the fear that I felt. A fear that I haven't felt the displeasure of feeling ever again. A pure and disgusting fear. A fear so terrible that it's almost incomprehensible. Fight or flight kicked in, and I kicked at that woman's hands as hard as I could with my free foot. Eventually, I felt her grip loosen, and I used the last of my strength to dart back to the surface. I scrambled onto the shore. When I emerged from the river, everyone was looking at me. I saw A there. When I stopped sputtering, I caught my breath and yelled at her. "Weren't you in there with me just now?" She didn't say anything, but all the other students, almost in unison, told me that nobody was in there with me. No one else was anywhere near me. If I hadn't kicked that woman so hard when I did, I might not have made it out of the river. When I think about how close I was to being dragged down to the depths by whoever that woman was, it still sends shivers down my spine. I'm not sure what exactly was going on here. Was she otherworldly, some kind of spirit or yokai or cryptid that preys on victims in the river? Or was she just a crazy woman grabbing a kid? I don't know. I don't think I'll ever forget what happened, though. This happened to my dad while he was with some friends of his. There were 3 of them in total. If anyone's interested in the location involved in this story, it's Ube City, Yamaguchi Prefecture, specifically on Ono Lake. It was just before summer during the rainy season. My dad was having dinner with his 2 friends. They were all talking together when one of his friends said, "Hey, you know what time it is now? It's firefly season. I just realized I haven't seen one." My dad and his friend were surprised by him saying this. They couldn't believe it either. They thought he was lying, because fireflies were absolutely everywhere around where they lived. Maybe they were a little rarer these days, though. My dad then said, well, if we head out to Lake Ono, we can probably see one right now. There's probably tons of them out there. After my dad suggested that, the three of them all got amped up and headed out to see the clouds of fireflies. They piled into my dad's car and headed to the beautiful park next to Lake Ono. There, they were sure to find these fireflies. Sounds like a wild reason to go on an adventure, doesn't it? They got out of the car and found a bench to sit down on, and just sat there drinking beers and talking. My dad wasn't drinking because he didn't want to get in trouble for drunk driving, though. They sat there joking around, saying how they must have looked quite odd to be sitting there in the middle of the night and stuff. Luckily, there didn't seem to be anyone else in the park that night. They were in high spirits, excited to see the fireflies and enjoying this moment of seclusion. After a while, they all started to flutter out, and it was a beautiful sight. They were quite easy to spot. His friends were getting a little too drunk at that point. They were getting quite loose. So was my dad. It was a night of good vibes, really. They watched for a while until they started to get tired of it. My dad felt as if it was time to start going home. He began to get to his feet, but he felt a hand clasp around his wrist. My dad stared at his friend. His friend then said, "You don't want to get up yet." He tugged at his wrist. My dad stared at him, wondering what was going on here. What kind of danger might be out there that they were about to get rushed into? He had no clue. His friend pointed behind the bench and tried his best to disguise the fact that he was pointing. "There's something freaky going on back there. What do you think it is?" My dad isn't the type to worry if someone says something creepy or strange is happening, so that was almost a relief to him. He spun around to look in the direction his friend was pointing. He was pointing out at Lake Ono. "Are you telling me you're seeing something out there? 'Cause I'm not really seeing anything," he said. "Come on, you must be able to see that," one friend said. "We better get going," the other said. "Yeah, let's go, agreed." My dad noticed their high spirits had faded. They seemed to have completely sobered up as well. They all headed back to my dad's car, and once they were in the car, they started talking. "Okay, guys, what exactly was I supposed to have seen back there? Are you seriously telling me you couldn't see that? Geez, you're such an old man," one friend jipped. "Well, I saw it and I don't really feel well anymore. I just want to get the heck out of here." "What's gotten into you two? All I could see was the lake and the fence that keeps people out." His friends were incredulous. "You didn't see that old man standing out there on the lake?" "What? You guys saw something like that?" My dad didn't believe them. They were claiming to have seen something otherworldly, some spirit standing on the surface of the water. Well, my dad might not have seen what they had, but he was good at reading the room, or in this case, the car. He decided to drive back home immediately. They needed a change of mood. My dad suggested they go to a local bar that was owned by one of their friends from their high school days. He figured there they could get back into the groove, plus they could have a beer too. They arrived at the bar and were greeted by their friend, who listened intently to their story. They were pretty lucky because they were the only customers in the bar that night. The barman said he had heard similar stories before about that lake at night, after they finished telling him what they'd seen. He turned his back to fix them another round. As soon as he turned his back, the front door of the bar spontaneously flew open. Everyone snapped around to see if there was a new customer coming inside, but there was no one there. Everyone around was now silent. They had all seen the door fly open by itself. They were freaking out. No one made a sound. One of my dad's friends said, "Have we brought something back here with us?" The barman grabbed some salt and told them to go sprinkle it outside around the bar in an attempt to keep the spirit from getting in. After that, they stayed inside for a while, and then all left and went their separate ways. My dad said that he told the president of his company about this experience once because he knew the president was into scary stories. The president explained the supposed backstory behind the event. "I'm not surprised you experienced something out on that lake. During the war, there were many casualties in that area. Koreans were worked to death there. Some were buried in the coal mines in that area. It was just an area with a very troubling history. I, 18 and female, live with my parents on their farm. We have a relatively big house with a nice back patio. We got a hot tub a while back as well, which my parents use a lot, and sometimes I join them. Since I have my own car, my parents have gotten more comfortable with leaving me at the house alone when they leave for extended periods of time. The longest they've been gone is about a week. They kept in contact with me the entire time, of course. I just take care of our animals and chill out, really, whenever I'm not working. I've gotten used to being alone. My parents were both raised in farming/ranching families, but I was more of a city kid until they bought a farm and moved us out there. I'm used to it now, but it took quite a bit of acclimating, considering I lived in our previous house for 13 years and knew the city like the back of my hand. You could have placed me anywhere and I'd be able to find my way back home one way or another. It's been a few years now and I consider myself well adjusted. Obviously, there are pros and cons, but I'm at peace with where we are now. One thing that took a lot of getting used to was just how much space we have. In the old house, my bedroom window lined up with the next door neighbor's kitchen window, and my curtains were drawn shut 95% of the time. Now, with my bedroom being on the second floor, and our neighbors being yards and yards away, I could get changed with the window open and not even have to worry about being seen. I mention this because it was unusual to have anyone walk past our driveway nowadays, as opposed to back in the city. Anyway, this took place a few weeks ago. My parents had gone to a distant cousin's wedding, leaving me at the house to look over the farm. I was fine with this, as I didn't really know said cousin very well. I sent my well wishes with my parents, and we sent constant updates back and forth for the few days they were gone. Earlier, I mentioned we have a hot tub on our back patio. I believe it was the second or third night, and I'd gotten home from work absolutely exhausted. I decided to relax in the hot tub for a bit to soothe my sore muscles before going to bed. I'm a bit of a night owl, so by the time I'd taken a nap and had dinner, it was around 11 p.m. or so. The sun had pretty much set. Another one of my favorite things about living on our farm is the lack of light pollution. I can look up and easily see the stars out above me. I've always been into astrology and astronomy. I love stargazing. That was part of the reason I waited so long before going out there. Anyway, I went out and got myself settled in. I sat there in the hot water, enjoying the stars and the heat, occasionally sipping my drink I'd brought out with me. It was still light out enough that I could see the edge of our property, dark enough that I could see the stars well, though. I had only been out there for about 10 minutes when I got this sudden chill down my spine. It was not from the breeze on my heated skin either. I suddenly felt like I was being watched from somewhere. Immediately, I was snapped out of my relaxed daze and turned to where I felt the feeling was coming from. It took my eyes a bit to adjust, but when they did, I felt my stomach drop at what I was seeing. From the patio, looking straight ahead, you can see our barn, which has some fences connected to it that make up a couple of pens. Our older horses are in the largest pen to the right of the barn, and behind that is a large field that stretches to a row of saplings. Beyond those saplings is a fence that indicates the edge of our property. While I couldn't see directly behind the barn, I could see somewhat beyond it, into the field behind the pens, which is where I spotted the figure that was causing my unease. A few feet out of the forest, standing between two saplings at the very edge of our field, was a figure, what I assumed was a person, standing there in the darkness and looking toward me. I immediately knew that was where this feeling was coming from. I stood up from the hot tub and turned to face that person. For a few moments, I just stood there, looking at them. I don't know if they could see me clearly. I certainly couldn't see them clearly. But when they didn't move after staring at them for a solid minute, I decided that I'd better get out of there. I closed everything up as quickly as I could, while trying not to panic. I went inside, where I immediately turned on all the lights, shut all the windows, and locked all the doors. My dogs had been inside the whole time, none the wiser to this trespasser. I figured it'd be best if I didn't alert them to what was going on, just in case it turned out to be nothing. I also debated on calling the police, but I lived 20 minutes from the nearest town. By the time they got there, the person would already be gone. It was beyond midnight at that point. I resolved to sit in the living room with my dogs and keep an eye on this suspicious figure from the inside. Our living room had windows that faced the same direction, so I could still see the same view from the hot tub. Ever since I'd seen that figure, it was impossible to not notice them afterward. The thought crossed my mind to grab my stepdad's rifle from the basement, but I had no idea where he stored it or how to even use it. It likely wasn't a wise idea, especially because it meant I'd have to leave the person outside unsupervised. The more time passed by, the more antsy I became. The person was just standing there, in the same position I'd spotted them in earlier, now staring at the house. Their apparent lack of motive was unnerving me like nothing else. I resolved that if they didn't leave within the next 15 minutes, I'd call the police. By that point, the person would have been standing out there for well over an hour, trespassing on our property. More time passed by. I stayed in the living room, phone in hand and dogs at my feet, looking out the window to see if the figure was still there. They were. By now it was 2:15 in the morning, and they still hadn't done anything. Internally, I was wondering who this person could even be. What reason would they have to do this? We're a friendly community, and we know pretty much all our neighbors. Everyone mostly keeps to themselves. It was unlikely that anyone would know my parents weren't home and I was there alone. There were 2 vehicles parked in our driveway, mine and my mom's. As far as I knew, we didn't have any issues with anyone. That's when things finally changed. As I looked out the window for the 50th time that night, the figure began to move. I froze, not moving a muscle. I watched them as they stepped back, turned, and walked back the way I assumed they'd come from. They disappeared behind the barn, and I could no longer see where they went, presumably back out into the forest. My relief was only temporary, though. While they did appear to be leaving, they could still very well be on our property, just hiding out in the trees somewhere. The feeling of being watched had disappeared, though, which made me feel at least a little better, but not by much. I decided to pull an all-nighter and stayed up until the sun rose. I passed out on the couch and woke up at around 1 p.m. I had a moment where I even thought I'd dreamed the whole thing. Just in case, after I finished up my chores, I made my way across the field behind the animal pens to our property line and walked from one end to the other to where the figure would have disappeared behind the barn. I wanted to see if I could find anything out of the ordinary. It had been dry for the past week, so the grass and dirt didn't show any footprints or any signs anyone had been there at all. That made me suspect that I had imagined the whole thing. Still, I just couldn't forget about that feeling, that unmistakable feeling of that person's eyes on me, not being able to tell what they were there for. To this day, I have no idea who it could have been. I have no idea why they just stood there watching me for over an hour. And to be honest, I don't really want to. Nothing like that has happened ever since, and I'm hoping it stays that way. This happened last December. I took my girlfriend on a late-night drive to see some of the illuminations in our town. There was a huge Christmas tree by a lake, and we both wanted to go check it out. I picked up my girlfriend one quiet evening in December. I remember it was raining and pretty cold out. I didn't expect much that evening, but it actually turned into a really fun night. We ended up staying by the river for a while, watching the Christmas lights until about midnight. It was at that point that we decided we wanted a change of scenery, so we set off on a late-night drive. We went to a nice secluded area. I parked where we were facing a grove of tall trees. I drove down to the end of the forest trail and we decided to sit in the back seat together, to make it a bit more cozy. I was back there with her and we were staring into each other's eyes. I could barely see her face because it was so dark. Just before we were about to take things to the next level, I noticed something strange. My eyes suddenly fell on the windshield. Before I tell you what I saw, I just want to emphasize something here. We parked in the most remote location I could think of. It was a forest trail that only led to dense tree line with nothing but darkness up ahead. Our location could be described as the epitome of the middle of nowhere. With you now picturing that scene, let me tell you how surprised I was to see a random woman leaning on our car's hood and peering in at us. She was an older woman, wearing a plain t-shirt. Why on earth would she be wearing next to nothing out here in the middle of December? It had been raining too, so I knew it was really cold. She must have been freezing. Her skin was so pale. The strangest thing about the situation is that if you see someone who looks pale and is dressed poorly in the middle of nowhere, you might expect them to bang on your windows, seeking some sort of aid. But not this woman. She just stood there peering in at us. She was glaring. I don't know why she was doing this. It all happened in a matter of seconds. My girlfriend hadn't even noticed she was out there yet. I didn't want her to see the woman, as I knew it would scare her quite badly. Honestly, we had watched a scary movie together about this sort of thing once, and it really traumatized her. She does not do well with scary. I looked back at my girlfriend. I didn't want her to notice I was watching the windshield. I gave her a big hug, and I moved her field of vision away. When I looked back at the windshield area, I was shocked to see that the woman seemed to have disappeared. Did she wander back into the forest where she came from, or did she even exist in the first place? I have no idea. Needless to say, we left in a hurry. I made some excuse about needing something from the store before we went any further. We left, and I wondered the whole way back home if it was all just in my imagination. That is, until I looked at the hood of my car in the natural light the following morning. I discovered something there. There were some indentations. Clearly, some kind of weight or pressure had been applied to the metal. The dents were fish-shaped. We drove down a forest trail in the middle of night, and it was so dark out that you wouldn't be able to see where you were going without a light. It was raining, too. The temperature was in the minuses. So what on earth was that woman doing out there with no vehicle to be seen? I've never told my girlfriend about what I saw that day. I just wish I had a dash cam or something, so I could take another look, or maybe even be able to show you directly. It was seriously creepy. This did not happen to me, but instead happened to a very close friend of mine. She told me that she wishes to stay anonymous, but what I can tell you is that she's in her 20s, and she's a very attractive person. I'll tell you this story as if it happened to me, so you can understand the way my friend told it. I had been working late at the office pretty much all week, which caused me to miss my regular bus home. Usually, if I wasn't working late, I would get off the train, then take the bus. But because I was working late, I had to get a taxi home all week. On the night this experience took place, I got off the train and saw there was only one other person waiting in line for a taxi. I was a bit relieved, because at least I wasn't going to be in for a long wait. Just as I was about to stand in line, a man came running down the station steps. He ran ahead of me and got into line. This both surprised and annoyed me, but I couldn't really do anything about it. I supposed I should have just rushed to get in line myself. I tried not to let it bother me. After all, it would still be a short wait. I lined up behind the man, and after waiting for about 15 minutes, a taxi turned up and picked up the first person waiting in line, a middle-aged woman. The metal shutters to the train station stairs behind me slammed closed. It was later than I thought it was. I wondered if the lights in the station would go out as well, and all the staff would leave. I didn't exactly want to be here all alone. Well, I wasn't alone yet at least. The man who pushed in front was still waiting for his own taxi. Moments later, a taxi pulled up and the man got in. Before he got in, I think we were waiting for about 20 minutes or so. It was a much longer wait than usual. Come to think of it, the first taxi that pulled up was black, and the second one was black as well. Was it just one taxi driver working? I made sure to take a look at the driver's face. I waited there alone now. It was a little unnerving. I hoped that a taxi would turn up soon. I didn't like being on my own in this dark area, so late at night. After another 20 minutes or so, a black taxi pulled up. It was the same driver I'd seen earlier. I climbed in, and I was so tired of standing there. I was just glad to be able to sit down. I told the driver where I wanted to go, and asked if he could drop me off at a certain location. "Can you take me to this construction yard?" I asked. The reason I asked for the construction yard was because it was close to my apartment, and drivers and delivery people can never seem to find where I live for some reason. The construction yard, at least, was well known and unmissable, so I always asked to get dropped off there instead. With that, we pulled away into the night. It was an extremely dark night. Summer had gone and autumn was now here. The taxi driver then began to speak to me. "Sounds like hard work, huh? You going there to work the night shift?" I was a bit too tired to enter conversation with the driver, so I replied something simple like, "Yeah, I guess." I'm always cautious when giving out personal information, and he really didn't need to know. I kept it vague. We got closer to the construction yard, and I started to root around my bag to grab the taxi fare. "Do you really work at one of those office buildings by the construction yard?" the driver asked me. What a nosy guy, I thought. "No, I don't." I replied to him a little sharply. I didn't know what he was trying to get at. Why did it matter where I worked to him? As soon as I told him I didn't actually work there, and I wasn't going on the night shift, he changed. Instead of pulling over by the construction yard, he sped up and kept going straight ahead. "Hey, you can drop me off here. You're going past it," I said. I started to panic. I didn't know what to do. The driver didn't say a word. He just focused on the road ahead. "Hey, here's fine. Let me out," I said. I could now hear the fear in my own voice. It had a shaky quality to it. "You got in my taxi on Tuesday night, didn't you?" "Yeah, I remember you," he said while glancing at me in his rearview mirror. He was showing no signs of stopping the taxi. I was really scared now. Scared of where all this was heading and where we were going. I had taken a taxi every night that week, but why did it matter? Why was this guy so invested in me? I sat there frozen in the back seat of the taxi. I can still remember the exact song that was playing on the radio. I couldn't understand what was happening. We drove for many more minutes down the dark highway. The lack of light made things 10 times worse. Up ahead, I saw the lights of a convenience store that I use regularly. I can remember thinking vividly, will anyone find me? When will this taxi finally stop? I had no idea what the driver's intentions for me were, nor what he was capable of. I think at that point I reached my limit. Tears began to roll down my cheeks. To my absolute shock, though, we actually pulled into the convenience store's parking lot. As soon as we stopped, the driver turned around and spoke to me in a calm voice. "I'm really sorry. If you want to make a complaint about me, you can. Here's my card and all my information. Call my bosses and tell them my name. It's all on the card." He went on to explain that he was the driver who picked me up and dropped me off on Tuesday, and because of the strange location I wanted to be dropped off at, he remembered me. He wondered why someone would want to be dropped off at the construction yard at night. He then told me that the man who had been waiting in line ahead of me at the train station had also asked to be dropped off at the construction yard, the guy who had rushed ahead of me. He said that while he was taking the man to the construction yard, he made a couple of fake calls pretending to speak to someone on the line. Then the man got out of his taxi and wandered off into the construction site. I asked him if it could have just been a coincidence and what he was trying to get at. He told me that the man didn't appear to be an employee, and there were no cars or trucks in the parking lot at all. There were no lights on in the office or in the yard. When we came back around with me in the car, he saw a minivan parked off to the side of the entrance with blacked-out windows, and there appeared to be people inside waiting. When the headlights shined on the windshield, they all ducked down, as if they didn't want to be seen. For that reason, he found it very suspicious, and he took things into his own hands and drove off with me in the car. I stared at the driver as tears began to form in his eyes. He told me that he couldn't stand dropping me off there, not knowing what was going to happen to me. He took a big risk doing what he did. It all could have been a coincidence, sure, but then I remembered something that made me shiver. While I was waiting, my mom had called me while I was in the line. She didn't like it when I worked so late, and she wanted to check in with me. I remember the words I said on the phone at that moment. "Yeah, I'm about to get a taxi now. I'll get to the construction yard." That man was in front of me at that point in line. It began to make sense. The driver was probably right. It seemed like the guy in front of me had something planned for me. I've thought about it for years, and I'm extremely grateful for what the taxi driver did for me. Of course, I did not end up reporting him. He may have saved me that night from an awful fate. Those men in that blacked-out minivan, I don't even want to think of what their intentions may have been for me. There's a stretch of highway which passes through several quiet mountain towns that connects two prefectures together. This highway runs alongside the Kana River. I was driving along this highway while it was getting dark out. Mount Miko was on the left, and we could see camper vans and tents set up along the river. My wife and I had been camping over a long weekend, and we were heading home. She was in the passenger seat next to me, chatting away. I was a little bit sad that I had work the following morning. I can't lie. The trip was over. In my back seat, my two children were steadily sleeping away. I looked over at the river. It was wide and was this beautiful deep blue color. It made it look more like a lake than a river. At that point, my wife looked over at me and said, "Hey, can we stop? I need to use the restroom." That sounded good to me. I wanted to get a drink anyways. There was a rest area coming up soon, and I knew there was a place to stop just after the tunnel, which was coming up on the road ahead. The road had a gentle curve, so I applied the brakes as I rounded the corner. I noticed that there were a bunch of people walking along the right side of the road up ahead. They were all walking the same way, towards Tokyo, with their backs facing towards us. I was surprised by what they were wearing. No one seemed like they were dressed for hiking or camping. They all had colorful clothes that seemed a little out of style. There were elderly people, children, men, women, people of all ages. It took a little while to overtake the group. I had to take it very slowly. It was really rare and kind of odd to see so many people walking out so late in a big group. I looked back in my rearview mirror, and I could see several of them raising their arms and waving at my car, presumably to get our attention or get us to stop, maybe even warn us about something. They were just about to enter the tunnel that I had just entered. "What do you think they want? Shall I pull over?" I asked my wife in a quiet voice. I didn't want to wake the children. "Speed up," she replied sharply. She raised her voice. I looked over at her, and she was staring straight ahead. "Don't stop!" she barked at me. Well, I did as I was asked. Something must have upset her pretty badly. I sped up, and fortunately there were no oncoming cars in the tunnel at the time. We drove through, and I pulled over into the rest area. I turned to my wife and asked her what was wrong. "None of them were wearing shoes," she said to me. "Shoes? What are you talking about?" I asked. At that point, I realized something a little shocking. I was surprised to see that no one from that group of people had gone through the tunnel yet, even though it was a very short one. We sat there for a long while. I didn't want to leave until I saw them again, but they just never appeared. My wife explained to me why she'd freaked out. She said there was a little-known urban legend about the river in the area, which made her panic. Apparently, a Japanese airline flight had once departed during a period in August. Unfortunately, it went astray and crashed into the ridge of the mountain upstream from the river. The voice recorder, or black box I think, contained a recording of the captain's instructions to the passengers. They were asked to remove their shoes and assume the brace position for impact. These days, passengers aren't instructed to take off their shoes on flights during an emergency. She grew up being told never to pick up hitchhikers near the river, especially if they weren't wearing shoes. Could we have seen the ghosts of those passengers? They were all heading toward Tokyo, where they'd departed from. I sometimes wonder if all they want to do is go home. It was pretty scary, I guess, but it makes me feel more sad than afraid. If those really were the ghosts of those poor passengers, I wonder how they must have felt in their final moments. It's no wonder they can't leave. This happened in 1996, in my hometown of about 100,000 people. I was 15 years old, from the suburbs, and went to a high school in the city. English is not my first language, so I apologize for any mistakes. I finished with class, and for some reason, I decided to walk to the main bus station instead of just waiting at the nearest bus stop. I stood by the gate that my bus line, number 15, started from. Another bus line, number 17, also started from the same gate. After waiting for around 10 minutes, a man asked me if bus number 17 had taken off yet. I told the man yes. I was sorry, but he just missed it. The man, who looked to be about 30 or 40, introduced himself to me as Mark. He stretched out his hand for me to shake it. I didn't want to be impolite, so I did, and introduced myself as Maya. My name is not Maya, by the way. It was bizarre to me. A grown man just randomly introducing himself to me at the bus station. I may have only been 15, but I knew this was a little bit weird. He asked if I'd just finished up school, and I said yes. He asked me what school I went to, and I lied. He asked me if I was going home, and I said no, even though I was. Instead, I told him I was going to a friend's house, and they were currently waiting for me. My bus pulled up, and I climbed on. Strangely, this man Mark got on as well. I know for a fact he asked me if number 17 had taken off yet. If he was originally planning on going on number 17, there was absolutely no reason to get on number 15. They didn't have a single stop in common. I sat down, and he situated himself right next to me. He asked me which year of high school I was in. I lied and said I was a junior. I was actually a freshman at the time. He even pointed this out and said I looked too young. He asked me if I had a boyfriend then. I said no, and he said I should. I asked him where he was going. He said he was going home. Wasn't he planning on taking number 17? He said no, and told me he lived at the very end of bus line 15. That was so odd. I'd never once seen him on the bus in all the times I'd taken it. Looking back, I knew instantly he was lying. I was sure he believed me, though, and I really thought I had the situation under control. I should have just walked right up to the bus driver and told him about this suspicious man. I didn't, though, because I wasn't scared enough. and I didn't want to make a scene out of nothing. There were plenty of people around, and while he was strange, I thought he was a harmless, lonely weirdo. We got to my stop, and I purposefully missed it and got off at the next one. I thought I'd fool him and walk home a bit longer. To my surprise, he got off as well. I asked him where he was going, and he said he wanted to walk me home. Again, I told him I was visiting a friend, and he said that was just fine. He'd walk with me all the same. I said he really didn't need to, and in a stern, irritated tone, he just told me to shut up and walk. There was no one on the street. We were the only ones who got off the bus here. I was alone with this increasingly unsettling man who had followed me all the way from the bus station. I couldn't go straight home because I didn't want him knowing where I live. I started to panic. I didn't know what to do. I just froze and stood there silent. In an instant, he'd gone from weird but chatty and smiley to telling me to shut up. I went from feeling in control to knowing I'd really messed up. He grabbed my shoulder and told me that he didn't have much time, so we should get this over with. I wanted to tell him that clearly he did have some time, but I didn't want to anger him. I just nodded, and he told me that if I was good, I didn't have to be scared of him. I lied and said I wasn't. He asked me if that meant I planned on being good, and I said yes. I began walking in a random direction. I didn't even know where I was going. I just walked and he followed me, his hand with an iron grip on my shoulder. I was never religious, but I remember praying in that moment. My heart was beating so fast, and breathing was so difficult, I was sure I was just about to collapse and die. At that point, I spotted an older man tending to his garden in front of a house. That's the last thing I clearly remember. I have a vague memory of taking off running. I was later told that I was screaming for help while running toward the older man. Meanwhile, Mark let go of me and ran off. The man called the police and they contacted my parents. The police couldn't do anything but take my statement. Since my parents both worked and couldn't take me to and from school, they bought me a phone the very same day. This was in the 90s, when mobile phones were a luxury. I wish the story ended there. After the event, I only ever got on the bus at the stop right in front of my school. A few weeks passed, and I did like I did any other day. One day, though, our eyes locked as soon as I stepped on. He was already on my bus, with the biggest grin on his face, like he couldn't be more excited to see me. I was so creeped out, I immediately got off and ran back to school. I called my mom in tears, and she had me find a teacher to walk me to her car when she came to get me. The whole school was also notified of the situation. After that, he was spotted walking around the school grounds several times, sometimes days in a row. He wasn't seen for a few weeks at a time sometimes. The police were of no help. They couldn't do anything until he actually hurt me or showed up directly on school property or at my home. I spent the rest of the year waiting in the school until late afternoon so my mom could pick me up after work. We always took a very long route home. I now know she was making sure we weren't being followed. My parents had me eventually switch schools as well. Thankfully, he was at least never spotted in my neighborhood, so I'm sure he never found out my real name or address. I only ever saw him one more time after we switched schools. I was 21 in my hometown, on summer break from university. I bumped into him in a grocery store. He didn't recognize me, didn't even look at me, but I immediately recognized him. Where I live, there's no list like in the US. Such cases are not reported, and I never found out the man's full name. I have no idea who he is or if he's done similar things in the past. I don't know what he would have done to me either. My belief is that he must have been mentally challenged, saw me, liked me, and followed me. My mother believes that it was much more complex, that he was planning something, and he knew exactly what he was doing. My dad doesn't even talk about it. This just happened yesterday. I'll preface this with the fact that we were entering into building phase on our house right now. I'm meeting a lot of contractors and new people because of this. We've been having trouble finding someone to do our foundation. Over the last month, I've called tons of people who said they can't do the job, but know someone who can, then give me their name and number. I call, get the same answer, rinse and repeat. After a ton of this back and forth, I finally land on the number of a guy named Joe. Joe sounded excited to do the job and was the most responsive and also the nicest person I'd run into so far, at least contractor-wise. We set up a meet time and he came out to my place to see the site. He seemed confident that he could do the job. He asked to take the plans home with him so he could go over them. He said he would get back to me with a quote soon. Agreeing, I gave him the plans, but told him I would need them back ASAP, and that was that. Not too long after, we met with a second contractor, who we ultimately ended up hiring for the job. On Friday, I realized Joe still had the plans, though. It was coming time now that the first steps were about to happen, and we really needed those plans back. I texted him, "Hey Joe, would I be able to come get those architectural plans from you tomorrow?" "Yeah, I can stop by tomorrow. I can meet you in town if that's easier. I need to go to the store anyway." "Alright, what time?" "Noon at the grocery parking lot." He agreed. Around noon yesterday, I arrived at the grocery store lot. I texted Joe right away, saying I'd arrived. He showed up soon after. He pulled up next to my car and got out. I got out as well, only to notice that he was empty-handed. Confused, I asked where the plans were and if he brought them. "Oh no, they're back at my house. Do you need them?" I was slightly annoyed at this point. I said yes. The guy who was prepping the site needed them. "Oh, well, if you need them so bad, you can follow me back to my house and I'll give them to you." I started to feel alert at this point. Nobody but my husband knew I was meeting this guy. I really did not know him very well either. I asked him how far his house was. He said it was in the neighboring town, 5 minutes and 4 miles away. The weird vibes were growing the more I thought about it. Clearly nothing to write home about, but I was ready to get out of there at the drop of a hat if necessary. "Listen, Joe, let me call my husband. I might not have time because we need to go somewhere." I walked away out of earshot so I could think straight and really call my husband. He thankfully answered, and I told him what was going on so far. He agreed it sounded shady and told me to be straight up with Joe and tell him I was not going to his home. I hung up and walked back to where Joe was waiting. I said, "So, I do have time, but I'm not going to your house. I don't know you well enough. I'll wait in the community development building parking lot across from the fish factory." It was a very loud, stinky place that you couldn't miss. Joe seemed confused. After a bit of back and forth and trying to explain what was going on, I offered to drive to the area first and he could follow me. That way he could see where I'd be waiting. Then he could continue to his house, grab the plans, and meet me back there. I'll also mention I was proud of myself. I tend to be timid and too polite, to my own detriment sometimes. I adopted a laser focus on my delivery for this time. I then got in my car and drove first. Joe followed me and I pulled into the parking lot. I made sure he saw me and noticed he'd stopped in the middle of the empty street. He was signaling for me to turn my car around. Since I was a good distance away, I got out of my vehicle so I could hear what he was saying. He was yelling for me to come back and follow him because his house was right there. I again said no. I was not going to his house. I was waiting right here for him to come give me the plans. A flash of annoyance went through him, but then he nodded and continued down the street, leaving me there to wait for him to return. Less than a minute later, he arrived back with the plans, handed them off to me, and I took them and said goodbye. I got right out of there. After I got out of the situation, I was able to think and reflect. It took him less than 1 minute to grab the plans from his house, so either one of two things happened. If he lived that close, why did he pretend like he didn't know the area I was supposed to wait for him? He could probably see it from his house with how close he was. Or he had the plans on him the entire time. I think it's good to note that my husband and I tried looking him up after this. There was nothing about this Joe on the internet. He didn't have a business email, a business name, or a registered phone number. In fact, I didn't even remember who'd given me his number in the first place. I now realize that aside from my husband, no one knew I had been talking to or meeting him. He simply doesn't exist as a contractor online, and since we never decided to use him as one, I'd never officially looked him up until now. I'm a biologist and frequently find myself in remote locations because of this. This occurred when I was 26, and somewhere between green and seasoned, I was surveying some wetlands in a remote area of the Appalachians. It was a part of the region that's particularly dominated by thick pine forests. I always got on the county assessor site and printed off a map with landowner information so I wouldn't get tagged for trespassing. That'll get you shot if you're not careful. This particular site, there was a driveway that ran through the U.S. Forest Service land, which is public. That allowed me to get into this area a little quicker. This driveway was absolutely public property. At no point did I trespass during this event. I pulled onto this road that was clearly created by the USFS and pulled off to the side about 30 yards from a private entry gate. My vehicle was a government vehicle. The forest is old-grown pine, but the outer edges of the forest is thick with undergrowth, forming a sort of wall before you even get underneath all the pine trees. I walked about 200 yards in when nature started to call. I made like a bear in the woods and did my business. I'm used to this sort of thing, so it was no big deal. Midway through, though, I heard a yelling back at my truck. I thought, great, now what do I have to deal with? I was wrapping up my business and getting ready to walk back when I heard gunshots ring out. I stopped walking and thought, yeah, I'm not walking back in that direction. I was at a loss of what exactly I should do, though. I stood there for about a minute, considering my options, when I heard whoever it was breaking through the undergrowth on the edge of the forest. Well, shit, he's coming into the woods now. I thought again, this is public property. I was getting a really bad vibe creeping up my spine. This is absolutely the type of area where people just straight up disappear. It's very remote, and the communities are all very closed off. This county has more than double the amount of game wardens of other counties, for very good reason. I take off in a crouching jog, using my sense of direction to make it out to the main road. I was about 600 yards away when I heard more gunshots ring out. These had a crack to them, though. That meant they were coming in my direction. There was no way the guy could see me, but maybe he was hearing me and firing randomly above my head or something. Adrenaline started to kick in. I was now moving with a mix of terror and urgency to get back to the main road. I eventually made it and hid underneath a bridge. I called a colleague and gave him the details of where I was, so they could at least find my body or something. I then called 911. This was the first time in my life I ever had to call 911. The operator didn't believe me, but eventually I did get in touch with a deputy. Unfortunately, he didn't believe me either. He gave me some speech about how they were probably just shooting tin cans. Motherfucker, it's Sunday night at 7 p.m. He was too lazy to get off his ass. I moved further away into a public hunting area, and finally a game warden stopped by. At least he took me seriously. A few of the locals also came by as well, and commented that they knew that particular landowner. He's an asshole. He was from Louisiana, I guess, and not even a local. I got along well with most of the locals I had encountered, so this made a little bit more sense. After about an hour, the warden gave me a ride back to my state vehicle. That son of a bitch was parked on an ATV and had a rifle laid across his lap waiting for me in the dark. The warden and I got out of the car, and I just walked straight back to my truck and left. It was about 9 p.m. then, and I had a 4-hour drive to get home. Just enough time. I didn't want to talk to this guy. Now though, I kinda wish I knew what conversation the two had after I left. After this, I started carrying a firearm in the field with me at all times. I'm glad I trusted my gut feeling and insisted on an escort back to my truck. That was not an encounter or conversation I wanted to have with someone with an overactive trigger finger. I had all the guy's contact information from the county assessor site. I thought about mailing him a map clearly stating where his property line begins and ends, but I just let it go in the end. Maybe he thought I was some type of creeper or something. Either way, the guy's a fuckhead. I have a story of the most frightening thing that's ever happened to me. When I was 7 years old, I lived with just my mom. After she left my dad, she started dating this very nice man. He lived on our street, and after I'd say about a month of him dating or so, he started to stay over at our house at night. He was a dentist and was really funny. He used to tell me a lot of jokes before I went to bed and say things like, "Did you make sure the monster under your bed isn't there tonight? If he is, just let me know and I'll beat him up real good for you." Being the young girl I was, I often would check under my bed just to make sure. One night he said what he normally said to me, but I responded, "There are no monsters. I've checked under my bed already." No monsters were ever there whenever I checked. Now, I told him monsters weren't real. He then looked at me and said they are real. He had seen them, and I needed to be careful. That night, I woke up to hear noises coming from underneath my bed. I was horrified, of course. I laid there just listening to these sounds. I was too afraid to check underneath. I told him I'd heard something underneath my bed that night, and he told me something along the lines of, "I told you so." That following night, I woke up to the same noises, but this time, I had the courage to look underneath. I stood up on my bed and jumped to my bedroom door, then turned on the light and kneeled down and looked underneath the bed. My mom's new boyfriend, the dentist, was laying underneath my bed smiling at me. He started to say something, but I ran to my mom's room and woke her up. Needless to say, she was very confused. After that night, I never saw that weirdo around again. I guess she dropped him like a hot rock or something. Hello everyone, I have a very creepy story to share with you all. It all happened in my own home, about 3.5 years ago. I've been divorced for about 10 years now, and this happened one night when my kids were over at my house. I was asleep in bed when I began to hear a noise. It was a very startling noise, like cabinets being slammed in my kitchen repeatedly. I'll be honest, I was afraid to even go check what it was. I'd never heard something like this before in the middle of the night. My kids were home though, so I had to see what it was as fast as possible. When I went out to my kitchen, the noise had already stopped. The cabinet door to my pantry was open though, which it never was left open. I looked around my house and checked on my kids as well. They were both still in bed. My son was wide awake and had heard the noises too, but my daughter had apparently slept through it all. I didn't find anyone or any explanation for the noise. I returned to bed and stayed vigilant, but I didn't hear anything again that night. The very next night, though, I was awoken once again to the exact same noises. When I rushed to check, I came up with nothing. Once more, my son had heard it too, but my daughter was fast asleep when I checked on her. I went back to bed and laid there awake and confused for hours on end. I felt very nervous and scared about what that noise was. The next night, though, I would find out exactly what was causing it. I was dead asleep when suddenly, right next to my bed this time, my closet door began violently slamming repeatedly. I jerked awake and turned over to see my daughter standing at the closet slamming the door over and over. I was terrified as I saw she was just staring at me with this wide grin. I jumped out of bed and stopped the door from slamming. I looked down into her eyes, and she looked like she was not there. Apparently, she was sleepwalking. The next day, she told me she had no idea anything had happened at all. What's really unusual about this is that it never happened again. As far as I know, she never had another instance of sleepwalking after this. One night, I had fallen asleep on the bed in my work clothes. It had been a very long day, so I was really tired. When I awoke, it was still dark. I was somewhat delirious. I sat up and kicked off my shoes from my feet, when just then, I heard the baby on the baby monitor. I picked up the monitor and heard my wife humming. I smiled as she whispered, "Go to sleep, go to sleep." My smile faded though, as I turned over and saw my wife was still asleep in our bed. I sprinted to the baby's room. She was crying, and the window was left wide open. The screen was laying outside on the grass too. That was the most horrifying thing I could possibly imagine happening. Something very creepy happened to me on Christmas. I had celebrated the holiday that morning with my family and went to see my parents on Christmas night as well. I had to go into work though to finish up a proposal I was working on for a new potential client. I obviously didn't want to go, but it had to be finished nonetheless. I worked in a building downtown that was fairly close to a few nightclubs and bars. My office is on the 23rd floor, and in my position, I have an office, but most of the floor is filled with cubicles. My office is in the very far corner next to my boss's, so to get to that area, you have to walk by all the cubicles in the center. I didn't get there too late, probably around 8 or 9 or so, but there was nobody else there. This was my second time going it alone. It was pretty peaceful actually. If I let my imagination run wild, however, I would get spooked quite easily. As I walked the path next to the cubicles, I was reminded of what I was currently missing at home while looking at all the Christmas lights strung up, decorating people's workspaces. There were no actual lights on, but it was lit up well enough by all these Christmas lights that I could still see. I reached my office and unlocked it. I walked inside but didn't close the door. My computer and desk faced away from my door, so I couldn't see anyone that approached my door. On work days, I always found this very annoying, as I never knew who would be knocking until I got up and opened the door to check. I sat down and began working as quickly as possible. I wanted to get home as soon as I can. After a while, I'd say about an hour into it, I heard the main entrance door close. I'd never heard it open, but when it closed, it made a distinct noise that was unmistakable. I wasn't too spooked at this point though. I was just curious as to who else was unlucky enough to have to come in and finish something with me. I got up from my desk and walked out onto the floor. I looked around, but I didn't see anybody there. I called out fairly loudly, "Hello?" Nobody responded at that moment though. I started to get paranoid and freaked out, because I definitely just heard the entrance door close. Somebody was here. Either they'd left immediately, or they were still in here with me hiding, not responding to what I was saying. I was just about to turn around and go back into the office and try to brush off what I heard, when I saw a head stick up out of the cubicle on the opposite side of the floor. Whoever it was looking right at me. I could see it appeared to be a man. but I couldn't make out any details of his face. I thought it must be one of my coworkers messing with me, so I shouted over to him. "Hey, what a time to have to come in, huh?" I hoped whoever it was would stand up and laugh with me, but they didn't. The man didn't move at all. This scared the crap out of me, so I tried to make conversation again. "Hey, guy, you know I can see you, right?" He didn't move at all. I wasn't sure what to do now. I was scared shitless, so I felt through my pocket for my keys. They were still there. I started walking down the path toward the entrance door, the whole time keeping a firm eye on this guy. As I was walking, I think he was watching me go. I looked over to the entrance door for just a second. One damn second. When I looked back, the man was already gone. After seeing this, I thought, oh my god, is he moving over toward me? I jogged the rest of the way to the door and rushed through it. I jogged over to the elevator too and slammed that button down hard. I turned around quickly as I heard the entrance door slam closed. It made that same distinct noise as before. The elevator door thankfully opened right away, and I went inside. I hit the first floor button, and the door closed quickly. I didn't see the guy following me. I drove home and told my wife what happened. I also had to call my boss and tell him the reason for not finishing my proposal that night. Thankfully, he was fairly understanding. I went back 2 days later with everyone else. I never found out who that guy was, or what that was all about. Nothing was stolen or tampered with to my knowledge, so what could he have been there for that night? This encounter happened to a friend and coworker of mine about 15 years ago. We'll call this friend Jody, and she lived in a suburb of Los Angeles, California, with her parents and older brother. It was a pretty nice neighborhood, and they didn't really have to worry about crime or break-ins or anything like that. One night though, at about 2 a.m., Jody was woken up by a loud knocking at the front door. She jumped out of bed and ran into the hallway, where her parents and brother were also coming out of their rooms. The knocking had since turned into a furious pounding. "Stay here," said her father, as he made his way to the front door. All of a sudden, there was a muffled male voice shouting, "Help me! Help me!" Jody and her mom grabbed each other in fear. Her dad looked out the peephole, only to see there was nobody there. He then looked out the front window too, where he could see part of the front door and porch, but he still couldn't find anyone. He walked back towards his family when the knocking started up again, this time much more frantic. The voice called out once more, "Help me! Help me, please!" Jody's dad went to the phone and called 911. While he was talking with the operator, her brother had walked up to the front of the house. The pounding was still going, getting faster and faster, until it was a constant banging and pleas for help. At this point, Jody was in tears from fright. She looked over at her brother, who was standing in the family room now. It was located just to the left of the front door. His face was pale white, and he made a gesture for them to come join him. Jody, her mom, and her dad, who was now off the phone with the police, hurried into the family room, where they immediately realized why her brother's face had gone so pale. The pounding and shouting appeared to be coming from underneath their floor. The police arrived minutes later. It turned out that some guy in his 20s had gotten high out of his mind that night on crack and made his way into the crawl space underneath the house. They never did find out his intentions, but it was assumed he was trying to find his way inside, presumably to rob them. Then, though, he got disoriented because he was so high and freaked out, hence the pounding and shouting. This story still gives me goosebumps to this day. I spent the first 10 years of my life in the city of San Jose, California. Whenever my mother could afford it, She would take me to a theme park in the neighboring town of Sunnyvale called Great America. We went about once or twice a year. The rides were all really fun, and the food was great too. I wasn't paying, so I had a good time whenever we went. That is, except for one time when I was 7 years old. About an hour or two into our day there, I got that feeling. You know, the one when you get that sneaking suspicion that someone you can't quite see is watching your every move. I mentioned it to my mother, and she said I was just imagining things. We went on about our day, and it was very fun as usual, but I still couldn't shake that feeling all day. In fact, it steadily got worse and worse until I literally started begging my mom to take me home. Eventually, she obliged, but she couldn't figure out what had gotten into me. Now, a little backstory. My parents got divorced when I was only a baby. When I was about 11, they reconnected and decided to get back together. So we moved to a shitty little town up north called Eureka. My dad's dad, I refuse to refer to him as my grandfather, lived in that same town. He never talked to anyone, not even his own son. He was in every sense of the word a recluse. He passed away not long after we moved there, and my dad, being his next of kin, was tasked with going through his things. The first word that came to mind when we entered the house was paranoid. There was at least one rifle in every single room, sometimes 2 or 3. There was a Colt 45 under his pillow, and another under the driver's seat of his car. There was a snub-nosed 38 in a Ziploc bag in back of the toilet. There were cameras mounted on every exterior wall, and there were boxes upon boxes of VHS tapes with the collected recordings from these cameras, some of which were nearly worn out from repeated viewing. Suddenly, from the master bedroom, I heard my mom yell out, "What the fuck?" My mom very rarely swore in front of me, so I knew it had to be something fairly serious. I ran into the bedroom, and what I saw in my mom's hand shocked me to my core. It was photos of me and my mother at the theme park that day. I was about 7 in those photos, walking along with a corn dog in one hand and a drink in the other. I had a suspicious look on my face, and I instantly remembered that day. My mother said that she felt faint and left the room. As it turned out, there were hundreds of pictures of us from that day, as well as from other times and places too. Some of them even appeared to have been taken from within arm's reach. I never felt so creeped out in my life. I don't know why he was spying on us, and I'm not sure I want to know. This incident happened about 7 or 8 months ago. I was the night shift desk clerk at a hotel, and let's just say there are a steady stream of creepers that pass through the lobby. I've had a ton of uncomfortable situations throughout my 3 years of employment there, but there was one particular guy that terrified me. It was around 2 a.m. or so when the guy walked into the lobby. The first thing I noticed was that he smelled god-awful, like burning plastic or something. I shrugged it off though, because at the time there were a lot of contractors that were in the area working at a chemical plant nearby. I just assumed he was one of those workers, looking for a quick nap or a hot breakfast. The morning came by and my shift ended. Fast forward to my next shift the following night. The smelly man from the night before had left all of his belongings in his room and was now nowhere to be found. He'd only paid for a single night, so the housekeepers had to move all his things to the storage room so they could prepare the room for the next guest. Around 8:30 p.m. or so, I get a call from a police officer. Apparently, this guy was a wanted fugitive because he'd nearly beat his wife to death just 2 hours before he checked in. I informed them of the items he'd left in the hotel room. I get the whole "do not engage, he's a dangerous and violent offender" speech, and now I was really scared. They said it was highly unlikely he would come back, but to excuse myself politely and call them if he did show up. Well, needless to say, he ended up back in the lobby not even 20 minutes later. He demanded the luggage he'd left behind. At this point, I'm doing whatever it takes not to show fear, because now I'm fully aware of what this fucker is capable of doing. I tried to play it off like I didn't know where his things were, so I could make an excuse to go upstairs and call the police. I'm not too sure where they are. Let me go take a peek in a few of the storage units upstairs. If you could just wait here in the lobby, I'll be just a moment. He didn't say a word, so I assumed he was fine with that. As I started walking up the stairs though, about halfway up I realized he was following behind me. It was at this moment I started to flip out internally. I had no idea what to do. I began to fake search through a few different closets. After about 10 minutes of this, he started to get very hostile. Where is my shit? I need my things right now! He slammed his fist through a wall to make his point. There was now enough distance between us, though, that I felt comfortable making a run for it. I fumbled with my master card and managed to lock myself in the closest vacant room. He banged on the door for a while, but left a short time later. The cops came about 20 minutes after this, but he was already long gone. Of course, they searched through his bags, only to find a stash of meth and drug paraphernalia. That explains the awful scent and his determination to follow my every step. I quit shortly after, and I'm still unsure if they ever actually found him. When I was a kid, I met a psychopath. Not an adult psycho, a kid the same age as me. He lived right next to me, and we lived out in the country. I still do now, actually. I've always loved living out here. So much freedom and peace and quiet. When I was a kid, exploring the farms nearby and down the old roads was the hip thing to do. When I first met this crazy little boy, I was around 10 years old. You could tell right away that he wasn't really all there. There was something wrong with him. You know, just when you were talking to him, you could tell there was something not quite right. I quickly learned how he really was when we went off to play one time. He would insist upon chasing chickens around, which was fine, I guess, but not really my idea of fun. I'd much rather build a treehouse or go exploring. Like I said though, I chased those chickens with this kid. But one time, when he actually caught the chicken, is when I realized I wanted nothing further to do with him. He just butchered it right in front of me. I was so shocked. He just grabbed a small hatchet and started hacking away at it. I acted like I was fine, but when I got home, I told my mom and dad what he did. They just told me to stay away from him from then on, and they would try to speak with his parents. From what I saw at the time, he had an alcoholic mother that paid very little attention to him. And his father, I had no idea. I wish I could say the story ends there, but yeah, it didn't. Unfortunately, I wound up hanging out with this kid quite a few more times. One of those times, my cousin had come over to spend the night. The next day, we were running and playing around when I think we found some rope in a barn. The old rope was about 5 feet long. We thought it would be fun to tie each other up in the barn. The kid that was tied up would try to escape from the binds, then commence with finding the other kids. A different version of hide-and-go-seek, if you will. I was tied up first. My cousin disappeared to hide, and very shortly after, the weird demented kid appeared in front of me. Thinking back on it now, I'm pretty sure he was spying on us and saw that I was alone and tied up. He came up to me with a very sinister smile on his face, like he knew he could do anything he wanted, and I was helpless. He walked up to me and knelt down to my face and whispered into my ear, "I'm gonna send you down to the fucking hellhole." I didn't say anything back to that because of how scared I was. He grabbed my face with both his hands and threw my head to the ground hard. It's silly, but I really felt like this kid was going to kill me. I told him that really hurt and to stop doing this, My cousin ran back in because of all the commotion, and that kid just acted like we were best of friends. He even asked if he could play with us. I told him no and to leave us alone. My cousin was very confused, but I told him later about what the kid had done. The last time I came into contact with him was weeks later. It was at the same barn. I was alone, just walking around exploring. I walked to the back of the barn, where there were very old metal bars laying around everywhere, as well as some old farming equipment. I saw some bright blue sneakers sticking out from behind an old tractor, and my curiosity led me to see what was happening behind it. When I got to the back, I was extremely startled to see the kid sitting on the ground surrounded by dead chickens next to him, smearing their blood all over his face like war paint. I said nothing and left in an instant. I really didn't have the desire to explore around my house anymore after. Thank God my mom and dad bought a new house far away from there, only months later. I have no idea what became of that kid in the end, but I'm sure he's locked away in a padded room somewhere. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with, and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.